If Jesus truly rose from the dead, it changes everything, not just for Christians, but for the entire course of human history. The resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't just a religious belief, it's the very foundation of the Christian faith. It's the claim that turned frightened followers into fearless preachers and ignited a movement that spread across the world. But here's the big question: is there solid historical evidence to support the resurrection, or is it just a comforting myth passed down through generations? In this video, we're not just exploring faith, we're diving deep into the facts, the historical records, and the eyewitness accounts. Join us as we uncover 5 key pieces of historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and why even the most skeptical historians struggle to explain them. Before we explore the evidence, let's set the stage. Jesus of Nazareth wasn't just a religious figure confined to the pages of the Bible. He was a real, historical person whose life and death are recorded not only by his followers but also by non-Christian historians. Writers like Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, and Tacitus, a Roman historian, both acknowledged Jesus' existence and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. These accounts, written by those outside the Christian faith, confirm that Jesus was more than a legend. He was a man who walked the earth. But what makes Jesus' story truly extraordinary isn't just his life or his teachings, it's what happened after his death. His followers didn't simply remember him as a wise teacher or a prophet, they boldly claimed something shocking: that he rose from the dead. This wasn't a quiet belief whispered among a few close friends, it was a public proclamation, spreading like wildfire in the very city where he had been executed. As the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 17, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile." In other words, everything hinges on the resurrection. If it didn't happen, Christianity crumbles. But if it did, it changes the course of history and the destiny of every human being. So, what does the historical evidence actually show? Evidence number 1, the empty tomb. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection is the undeniable fact of the empty tomb. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, consistently report that Jesus' tomb was found empty just days after his crucifixion. But what makes this account even more remarkable is who discovered the empty tomb. It wasn't influential leaders or powerful men, it was women. In ancient Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was often considered unreliable and held little weight in legal matters. If the gospel writers were inventing a story to convince the masses, they would have chosen respected male witnesses, not women. So why would they record women, specifically Mary Magdalene and others, as the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb? The most logical explanation is simple: because that's what actually happened. And here's something even more striking: Jesus' enemies never denied the tomb was empty. In Matthew 28 verses 11 to 15, the Jewish religious leaders didn't try to claim that Jesus' body was still in the tomb. Instead, they accused the disciples of stealing it, essentially admitting that the tomb was, in fact, empty. Think about that. The very people who wanted to silence Jesus' movement accidentally confirmed the one thing they wanted to disprove: the missing body. So the real question is, if the tomb was empty, where was Jesus' body? The disciples claimed he rose from the dead, but what other explanation could there be? Evidence number 2, eyewitness accounts. The resurrection wasn't based on secret visions or hidden revelations, it was rooted in public, first-hand experiences. Jesus didn't just appear to a few close followers who might have been prone to wishful thinking, he appeared to over 500 people at once. The Apostle Paul documents this in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 7, a creed that most scholars agree dates back to within 5 years of Jesus' death. This makes it one of the earliest records of the resurrection, not a legend developed over centuries. Paul writes, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, and after that, to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time." But here's what makes this even more powerful. Paul doesn't just list names, he invites people to fact-check him. When he wrote this letter, many of those 500 witnesses were still alive. If Paul was making this up, anyone could have challenged him, but no historical records show anyone disproving his claims. And let's not forget Paul's own story. He wasn't a follower of Jesus at first. In fact, he was a fierce opponent of Christianity, hunting down believers and throwing them in prison. But something happened that changed everything. Paul claimed that Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. That single encounter transformed him from a violent persecutor to one of Christianity's greatest defenders, a man who would eventually suffer beatings, imprisonment, and even martyrdom for proclaiming the resurrection. Why would a former enemy of the faith risk his life for a lie? The most logical explanation: Paul genuinely believed he had seen the risen Jesus. So, we're left with a critical question: how do we explain these multiple, consistent, and life-altering eyewitness accounts? Evidence number 3, the disciples' transformation. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for the resurrection is the radical transformation of Jesus' disciples. Before the resurrection, these men were anything but bold. They were scared, confused, and defeated, hiding behind locked doors in fear of being arrested and crucified just like Jesus. Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, famously denied knowing him 3 times the night of his arrest. These weren't the actions of courageous men, they were terrified. But something happened that changed them forever. After seeing the risen Jesus, these same fearful men became unstoppable preachers, boldly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, even in the face of torture and death. Peter, the man who once denied Jesus to a servant girl, went on to preach publicly in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified, and according to historical records, he was eventually crucified upside down because he refused to stop spreading the message. Then there's James, Jesus' own brother. He was once a skeptic, thinking his brother was out of his mind, but after witnessing the resurrection, James not only believed, he became a leader in the early church and was ultimately stoned to death for his faith. Let's pause for a moment. What could possibly turn a group of scared, defeated followers into fearless martyrs? Here's the hard truth: people don't willingly die for something they know is a lie. Sure, people might die for something they believe to be true, but if the disciples had stolen Jesus' body or fabricated the resurrection story, they would have known it was all a hoax. Why would they endure beatings, imprisonment, and violent deaths for a lie they invented? The most reasonable explanation is simple: they weren't dying for a lie, they were dying for what they had seen, the risen Jesus. Their transformation wasn't based on blind faith, it was rooted in an event they witnessed with their own eyes. Evidence number 4, the explosion of Christianity. Another powerful piece of evidence for the resurrection is the sudden and unstoppable explosion of Christianity. What's truly remarkable is where this movement began, not in some distant town where facts could be blurred, but right in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been publicly crucified. Think about it: if Jesus' body was still in the tomb, the Jewish and Roman authorities could have crushed this movement instantly by simply producing his body. All they had to do was roll back the stone, display the corpse, and silence the disciples' claims forever. But they didn't, because the tomb was empty. Instead of dying out, Christianity spread like wildfire, not over centuries, but almost overnight. Just weeks after the resurrection, Peter stood in front of thousands in Jerusalem, the very people who had witnessed Jesus' death, and boldly declared that Jesus had risen. And what happened? 3,000 people believed that day. Within a few decades, the message had spread beyond Judea, reaching cities across the Roman Empire, despite severe persecution. Historians are left asking, how did this happen? New religions don't typically explode into existence in the very place where their central event, the resurrection, could have been easily disproven. The most reasonable explanation: the followers of Jesus weren't just spreading a belief, they were spreading a message based on what they had seen, a risen Savior. Evidence number 5. Non-Christian historical sources. The resurrection isn't just a claim found in the Bible, it's also acknowledged by several non-Christian historical sources from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Let's start with Josephus, a 1st-century Jewish historian. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, he wrote about Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate and mentioned how Jesus' followers claimed he had appeared to them alive after his death. What makes this so important is that Josephus wasn't a Christian, he had no reason to promote the resurrection. In fact, as a Jewish historian, he simply recorded what was being said and believed at the time. Then there's Tacitus, a highly respected Roman historian. In his work Annals, written around 116 AD, he confirmed that Jesus was executed during the reign of Pontius Pilate and that a pernicious superstition, widely understood to be the resurrection, spread rapidly through Judea and even into Rome. Tacitus despised Christians, he called them detestable, yet he still documented these events, showing that Jesus' death and the rise of Christianity were undeniable facts in the Roman world. Even the Babylonian Talmud, a collection of Jewish teachings, mentions Jesus and his followers. It acknowledges Jesus' existence, his crucifixion, and the way his disciples continued to spread his message after his death. Why does this matter? Because these sources come from people who were opposed to Christianity. They weren't trying to prove the resurrection, they were simply recording what was happening. And yet, they confirm key details, that Jesus lived, was crucified under Pilate, and that his followers were so convinced he had risen that they spread his message, even at the cost of their own lives. So the question remains, if the resurrection was just a myth, why didn't these non-Christian historians simply dismiss it as a lie? The most reasonable explanation is this: something extraordinary happened after Jesus' death, something his followers were willing to die for, and something even his enemies couldn't fully explain. Of course, skeptics have their theories. Let's break them down. Some suggest that the disciples stole the body and fabricated the resurrection story. But here's the problem: why would these men willingly face torture, imprisonment, and even death for something they knew was a lie? People may die for something they believe to be true, but no one dies for something they know is false. The disciples weren't gaining power, wealth, or status, they were persecuted, beaten, and executed. The idea that they would endure all of this for a hoax simply doesn't hold up. Another theory claims that Jesus didn't really die, he just fainted on the cross, later revived in the tomb, and somehow convinced his followers he had risen. But let's be clear, Roman crucifixions were brutal. These soldiers were professional executioners. Jesus was flogged, a punishment so severe it often killed people even before crucifixion. He was nailed to a cross, pierced with a spear, and when he was taken down, the Romans confirmed he was dead. Are we to believe that, after suffering all this, Jesus somehow unwrapped himself from his burial cloths, rolled away a massive stone, overpowered armed Roman guards, and appeared to his disciples looking victorious, not half dead? The idea is not just improbable, it's impossible. And then there's the mass hallucination theory, the claim that the disciples, overwhelmed by grief, all imagined seeing Jesus alive. But science doesn't support this. Hallucinations are personal experiences, they don't happen in large groups. Yet, according to 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6, Jesus appeared to over 500 people at once. Were they all hallucinating, at the same time, in the same way? Even modern psychology rejects this theory. So, when we weigh these counterarguments, we're left with a question: which explanation makes the most sense? A stolen body, a half-dead Jesus, or a mass hallucination, or the simple yet extraordinary reality that Jesus really did rise from the dead? Even secular historians agree, something happened that radically transformed Jesus' followers. They went from being terrified, hiding behind locked doors, to boldly preaching in the very city where Jesus was crucified. They didn't just risk their reputations, they risked their lives. Peter was crucified upside down. James was stoned to death. Paul was beheaded. Something gave them unshakable courage. So, the question isn't whether something happened, it's what happened. What could turn ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and even skeptics into fearless leaders who transformed the world? The most reasonable explanation is that they saw the risen Jesus. And if Jesus really did conquer death, if he truly rose again, then this isn't just ancient history, it's a message that still matters today. Because if he defeated death, what does that mean for your life? Your struggles? Your future? If this video made you think, if it stirred something in you, then imagine what more we can uncover together. This is just the beginning. So, hit that subscribe button, not just to follow a channel, but to join a community that seeks truth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, a friend, a family member, because you never know whose heart might be touched. And most importantly, drop a comment below. What do you think about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection? Be honest, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or just someone searching for answers, your voice matters here. Let's keep this conversation going, because faith isn't about ignoring facts, it's about confronting them. And together, we can explore what it truly means to live a life fueled by faith and purpose. Join the Divine Drive family, where faith meets truth, and hearts find hope.